In our final part for chapter 13, where we're looking at the spinal cord, we're going to be dealing with spinal reflexes. So when we talk about reflexes, reflexes are rapid automatic responses to very specific stimuli. Their purpose is to have us have some sort of reaction that is going to be faster than if we had to process that information through multiple areas of the CNS. So it lets us make very rapid adjustments in function of our organs or organ systems in order to preserve homeostasis. The wiring of a single reflex that we have is referred to as our reflex arc. And with our reflex arc, we are going to have a 5-stage process that is going to be happening. So the first step is going to be arrival of some stimulus. That stimulus is going to have a receptor at the end of some sort of peripheral effector. That could be a muscle fiber or some sort of gland cell. And a simple reflex is going to have just these exact 5 steps, where you have that stimulus, that receptor is activated on the sensory neuron, which is going to bring that information in through the posterior root into the spinal cord. Now, because this is a spinal reflex, the interneurons within the spinal cord itself are going to process that information and decide to respond automatically to it. So it's going to automatically send out a motor response to the anterior root, and the anterior root is going to activate that motor neuron, and that motor neuron is going to go to our effector, which is going to cause an effect by that peripheral effector that we have. In this case is going to be a muscle. At the same time that that information, the CNS, specifically the spinal cord, was being sent out through the motor neuron, we are still going to send out that lateral information. 3, 2, 1. At the same time that you have that interneuron within the spinal cord sending that information through the motor neuron, then you will have a collateral neuron that's going to be taking that information upward. So you are still going to send that information through the spinal cord to the brain for the brain to process so that you know what's happening, but your response was going to be initiated right away by the interneurons within the spinal cord. So in this case, you can see the stimulus is some sort of pain stimulus where you got poked by something. You're going to want to not keep your hand there and continuing to get punctured by this little tack, so you're going to want to very quickly pull your arm away. So with the stimulus, oftentimes what will happen in this withdrawal reflex arc is that you will have some sort of injury that's happening and you will pull away before you even feel the pain. Now, of course, you'll feel the pain later because this collateral neuron is taking that information up to the brain and it's going to process it, but oftentimes you will have moved before that. So this is going to be a safety feature that is going to prevent you from damaging yourself further. Now that we talked about the reflex arc and how it was just those 5 stages as a basic reflex arc, the reflexes that you have can be classified in different ways. So we have the 4 different types of ways that we can classify our reflexes. So starting with development. When we look at development, you can either refer to them as innate reflexes or acquired reflexes. Innate reflexes are genetically determined. You are born with it. So once you're born and as a newborn, the doctor will start testing different things. Those are all innate reflexes. Acquired reflexes are things that are learned. You have rapid, automatic learned motor patterns based on things you do repeatedly. And so those repetitions just enhance how fast those reflexes are going to be. So like when you brake during an accident in your car and you hit those brakes and you do it so quickly, that's an acquired reflex that you have. We can also do it based on the type of response, whether we're looking at the somatic or the visceral responses. So when we're talking about somatic reflexes, we're talking about the skeletal muscles and how they're contracting, and you're going to have the superficial and stretch reflexes that are going to help to trigger these responses. When we're talking about visceral, these are also referred to as autonomic reflexes because they're controlling your internal organs and what their response is going to be. We can look at the complexity of the circuits, where you will have just the one synapse, where you're having the neuron of one ending and then starting with a different neuron. And then, of course, you have polysynaptic, which are going to be much more complex, and you have multiple synapses, anywhere from 2 all the way to several hundred synapses that are going to occur because of some particular stimulus. And then, of course, you have your processing sites, where you're either having the spinal reflexes or cranial reflexes. So spinal reflexes are going to be processed by that spinal cord, so you have a super fast reflex, or you're going to have cranial reflexes where it's cranial nerves taking information and they're bypassing the spinal cord, they're going straight into the brain and the brain is going to process it. When we're talking about somatic reflexes, we're going to specifically look at our skeletal muscles. So within the skeletal muscles, you're going to have what we refer to as the muscle spindle. And those are going to be sensory receptors that are all going to be involved in a stretch reflex. So they're going to have different fibers which are going to be considered extrafusal as well as intrafusal muscle fibers. So intrafusal muscle fibers are going to be small bundles of specialized skeletal muscle, and they're going to have dendrites of sensory neurons that are going to be wound around the central region of that intrafusal fiber, and they detect when stretching is going to occur. The extrafusal muscle fibers are going to be surrounding that on the outside of it. So here we had it reflected so you can see kind of inside, and these are going to be the fibers that are going to be on the outside. Let's look specifically at that complexity in ways to classify our different reflexes. We have those 5 steps that we have within our reflex arc. And within those 5 steps, you can have monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflexes. When we say monosynaptic, it's exactly what the name says. You have one synapse that's going to be involved. So when you have a stimulus that's going to occur, a sensory neuron is going to pick up that signal and it's going to send that signal directly to a motor neuron, which is going to respond because of it. The knee jerk reflex is an example of this, where you have a hammer that's going to tap on the patellar ligament. The tapping on that patellar ligament is going to pull the muscle, which is going to cause it to stretch, and then our muscle spindle is going to detect that stretch with that receptor, send the signal through our sensory neuron straight through to our motor neuron, which is going to cause the contraction of the quadricep muscle, causing the kick. So that's a monosynaptic reflex where it's just bam, bam, and then that's your response that's going to happen. So it's going to be very fast because of only that singular synapse. Polysynaptic reflexes, though, are going to involve at least one interneuron that's going to help to process that information. The withdrawal reflex is going to be an example of this. So you have some sort of painful stimulus that's going to be detected. You're sending that signal through the sensory neuron, and then you're going to have some excitatory interneuron that's processing the information, which is going to cause a stimulation of the motor neuron. So we have a synapse here, and then we have another synapse here. At the same time, while this is happening, you're also sending signals upward so that you're going to process the pain later, but you're going to have this immediate withdrawal and pulling back of your hand from the painful stimuli because of the flexors that are going to be stimulated by that motor neuron. So this is going to be a little bit of a delay compared to the monosynaptic, but still a fairly quick reflex that's going to be happening. You can also get a little more complicated here, like this crossed extensor reflex. This involves contralateral reflexes, where contra is going to mean opposite. Notice that when we have the signal coming in through our posterior side from our sensory neuron, it's going to innervate and go into both the side that it came from, as well as crossing to the other side of the spinal cord to affect both sides of the body as the motor neurons are going to be taking that information. Of course, as you're going through all these different places, each of these is going to have their own synapse, so this is going to be a polysynaptic reflex. These types of reflexes are going to give you a lot more complicated responses because you're going to be controlling multiple muscle groups that are going to allow this. Withdrawal reflexes, tendon reflexes, crossed extensor reflexes like we saw here, all of those are going to be complicated polysynaptic reflexes generally. The tendon reflex that we have that I just mentioned is going to prevent your skeletal muscles from developing too much tension. The amount of weight that you can actually lift is higher than what you do in practical situations because your stretch receptors are detecting the amount of load that you're able to carry, and it will stop you by developing too much tension so that you don't break your tendons. Now, with these reflexes that we've talked about stimulating all these muscles to contract. But at the same time as they're doing that, we have what is referred to as reciprocal inhibition. So when we look at our muscle groups where we have our agonist and an antagonist, the antagonists are also going to have to be inhibited at the same time that we're going to be stimulating other muscles. So when your flexors are going to contract, your extensors are going to relax. When your extensors contract, your flexors are going to relax. Now, looking at all polysynaptic spinal reflexes, there are 5 general characteristics that are going to be occurring for all of these different reflexes. So first, we're going to involve many pools of interneurons. They could be exciting or they could be inhibiting the neurons that are coming from that. And you're going to have more than one spinal segment that's going to be involved within this reflex because there are muscles in different areas of your body that are going to need to be activated in order to coordinate the reflex. There's also going to be reciprocal inhibition, where you're going to have coordinating of contractions and reducing the resistance by having some inhibited while others are going to be excited. They will oftentimes also have these reverberating circuits. So looking at those neuronal pools that we talked about, you're going to have that reflexive motor response that's going to have that positive feedback loop, so it's going to prolong that motor response. And oftentimes several reflexes are cooperating with each other because you're going to have a coordinated, controlled response that's going to occur. So these are not just happening in isolation. Everything that we've been talking about is how the spinal cord is initiating these reflexes. The sensory neurons taking the information in, the spinal cord is then causing some sort of response because of it. But of course, the brain is also going to be involved, even though these are spinal reflexes. The brain can actually alter how the spinal reflexes are going to be managed over time because it's going to allow us to integrate and control all those spinal reflexes together. So while the reflex behaviors are automatic, the processing in your centers of your brain can either facilitate or inhibit those spinal motor reflexes. If we're talking about reinforcing the different reflex you have, the EPSP is going to happen. Like we mentioned in chapter 12, the EPSP stands for excitatory postsynaptic potential. And when that happens, the EPSP means that the postsynaptic neuron is more likely to fire an action potential because it is excitatory. So during reinforcement with the brain, we're going to cause that to happen more quickly. With IPSP, that's inhibitory postsynaptic potential. And so sometimes the reflex behaviors over time are going to cause us to inhibit by not having a motor neuron fire in the postsynaptic area. The brain is going to see these over time, and it's going to make the behaviors a lot faster and automatic when you have repeated exposure to them. In our next chapter, we will talk about the brain, and then we'll talk also about the cranial reflexes that are happening within the brain itself.